lighting. Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at a Springfield... blah. Let's try that one more time. Today we're going to look at a Smith&Wesson M&P. This happens to be an M&P 40, but this will apply to anything in the M&P line. They're fundamentally the same. Any variations should not throw you for that big a curve. The design is consistent. So, without further ado, no magazine, and nothing in our chamber. Field strip this. There's the obvious takedown lever, but that's not all. The Sear is going to get in our way, and so Smith&Wesson cleverly added this little yellow lever right down in the guts there, and you just pull that lever down into the body of the gun. So it's normally sitting back there. Stick it down so it's intruding into the magazine well. You're going to need to hold that takedown lever down while you do this, and you'll be able to bring the slide right off. Now the reason we had to do this is a better view of that little lever. If you notice, when I flip the lever, the Sear is moving. And that's exactly what we needed to do. When that lever's up, the Sear is up there doing its job, and pulling the trigger will lower the Sear, but we need something to keep it out of our way. And so rather than including a trigger pull as a step in the takedown like Glock did, they put this in there, this Sear decoupler. It's actually pretty nice because the way it's built, it intrudes into the magazine well. So when you reassemble, if you forget to push it back up and your Sear is, not going to be connected to anything, trigger no longer affects the Sear. Once you put in a magazine, the magazine itself pushes the yellow lever right back up to where it belongs, and now our trigger is engaging again. So it's just a takedown step. You don't even have to remember it when you're putting it back together, and you still won't run into trouble. Set the frame aside for now. Finish our field strip. Captivated guide rod, metal guide rod with a flat wound spring and a hex head screw, so you can replace the spring without having to replace the whole rod. Thank you very much, Smith&Wesson. And a barrel that is not particularly fascinating compared to anything else out there in this striker fired standardized line of guns. It does have a slightly larger end towards the crown, which means that when it is locked up, it will be more stable. If you have a barrel that's the same size all the way through, then that means that the same amount of slop it has to be able to tip and slide is going to be present when it's locked up. But if your barrel is slightly bulged at the end, then that means that in that perfect locked up position, it has less room to wiggle, so it's not going to move around in the frame, give you more consistency. Shot to shot. I meant to say slide, not frame. So, striker fired gun, and has a firing pin safety. A striker can't come forward unless the safety is pushed, and then we get our firing pin protruding. But without that being pushed, no go. So something in the frame will be lifting that up during our trigger pull. It's going to have an extractor pin and a spring in there, and then some sort of striker assembly that we're going to get to right here. If you look, similar to a Glock, there's a plastic piece that you can see through the opening in the bottom, and that plastic piece actually rides on the other side all the way up and is actually locking into the back plate, and that keeps us from getting our back plate off. So you come in here with a punch and you pull back on the little white plastic gizmo, and now your back plate will just lift right off. This cut in the back plate is what this white piece of plastic is engaging with, and that's what we're moving forward when we're doing that. To get the striker out, you just push down on the firing pin assembly and it should pop right out, whole striker assembly. We'll take that apart in just a second. Firing pin safety is not going to come out because it actually goes in through the top of the slide, and you have to remove the rear sight to do it, or at least move it halfway off to the left. It's bored in from the top, and it has a wider bottom so that it can't fall all the way through. The only time you would need to get that out is if you were replacing the spring. Because of the way it's designed, it's pretty hard to get schmutz up in there. It's a pretty good sealed chamber, so you generally don't ever need to do that. But if you're dropping in one of the Apex enhancement kits, a lot of them do come with a lighter firing pin safety spring. This one's pretty stiff, and it does add to the trigger pull. So if you do have to take that out, don't forget to unscrew the little screw so that you're not pushing against your retention mechanism. Push it off, right side to left side, so it's coming off on the left. You only have to get it halfway off. You can replace all that stuff and then put it right back on. Tighten your screw down, and you're good to go. We're going to knock out our extractor system here. If we can find our hammer. And we run into the lights again. This pin tends to be in there pretty tight. I had to give this one a pretty good wallop to get it started. And slide that out. The other thing about this extractor is that the normal width body of the extractor is like that, but if you notice when it's out, it's got this big overhanging lip that's gonna drop down below, so you can't just lift it out to the side. You've got to either rotate it and lift it up or whatever, because it's blocked. And if we look at the shape of the whole thing, it's a pretty substantial extractor. I kind of like that. Again, it's got a slight angle cut on the bottom, so that a round coming up can cam it out. It's got the angled face that all extractors have, so they can snap over the rim of a round. And then it's got essentially this big ass claw, so it's going to hang on to that round, but good. And a substantial spring to add pressure to the extractor. Now, just a note about extractors. That big old spring is important, but smart gun design uses physics for this more than spring pressure, and it's just the weight of the metal is going to be used to take care of a lot of what's going on. The spring really shouldn't be the deciding factor. If the spring is the deciding factor, the spring tends to have to be very, very large. So the idea here is you're going to pivot around the pin, and what you want is that when the slide is moving backwards, you want the extractor to be pushing in against that round nice and tight so that it doesn't slide over it. So you want the extractor to rotate into this, inside of the frame. So the slide starts to move back. You want that action to naturally pull that in, which means that you want the center of mass of this extractor to be on the outside of the pin and in front of it. So you want the center of mass out here, because it can rotate in any direction, in which what's going to happen when that starts to come backwards, it's going to rotate because that so that the center of mass is as close as it can to directly in line with that line of travel. So if it's sitting in here like this naturally, and it could swing left or right freely, and I just started to move this backwards really fast, what would happen is this would naturally swing like that, so that the center of mass would be right in line with the direction of motion. And that means that by having more mass on the outside, when this goes to extract, it's going to want to swing towards the inside and put more pressure on the claw. So that's why extractors tend to be bigger than they absolutely need to do to just provide a claw right there. Well thought out extractors are going to use that simple mechanical aspect of the weight of the metal, the mass of the metal, to do a lot of that extractor force for them. And again, that's letting the natural motion of the machine do the work, instead of having a big spring that's 100% responsible for all the force that's put in there. That's it for the slides. We're not going to pop that out for now. Let's take a look at that striker assembly, because it's a little bit funky. It's similar to the Glock, but enough to avoid a patent fight like they got into over their previous version of this gun. So instead of having two spring cups, they have a single spring cup mechanism. Again, to take this apart, you have to have something that's going to hold the striker itself from going back as you compress this spring. And I just use my finger to do that. And compress the spring, and this plastic piece has an opening on one side that lets us just slip it off the firing pin. So without the spring in our way to see what's going on there, This flat area of the firing pin means that this piece can slide right in, and once it's in there, then the spring will engage it and keep it from going anywhere, and it'll just naturally ride up to the top. The rest of it, the sleeve part, just pops off. It is a little stiff at the very end because the very end of the striker is a little bit large, because you generally aren't taking this off very often, but you do just pull. It does have this other spring in there as a rebound spring. I'm not 100% convinced that it's a necessary part, but I've never really put the brain power in to study it long enough to figure out why Smith&Wesson felt the need to. I'm sure if they didn't have a real reason to, they wouldn't have put this fragile and expensive to make spring in there. But frankly, I haven't figured that one out yet. Again, when this sleeve goes on, there's really only one orientation that the thing can go in. Anything else, and it's not going to fit right. There's a wide side, an even wider side, and a narrow side, and only one of those is going to ever line up with that sleeve. And it's technically the medium-wide side, for what it's worth. Some of the rest of the striker design is kind of ornamental rather than functional. The extra grooves, the cam down area to this leg, that's an awful lot of extra machining, but none of it is particularly important to how it works. Basically they keep the striker wider for the part that actually slides back and forth in the frame, in the slide. Well, that's not going to do that if I don't have something in there to brace it. So, as this is sitting in there, that wider area is towards the top, so that gives it a little more left-right stability than if it were narrower, but not really, so to speak. And then it narrows down so that when it's moving in the frame itself, in the Sear section, that leaves more room for the rest of the Sear parts if they make that smaller and not as wide as the bottom. So they just kind of reduce it in size as they go. Why they came up with this funky, fancy mechanism towards the front, I have no idea. But it seems to wear well. I don't know what it's coated with, but it's a good coating. Even where that Sear engagement is, it doesn't really show much signs of wear. So when you put it back together, don't forget the little buffering spring there, rebound spring of some sort. I'm going to slide the striker back in to the frame, and remember that this plastic part is going to come sticking way out the back, so you do have, it will be compressed in its normal state. Your spring goes on. The spring does not have a front or back like the Glock spring does. It's unidirectional. And again, to get that the rest of the way back together, you just got to get that pulled down and spring cut back in. And then we're good to go. So as you slide that back in, you're not going to get it all the way back in unless you again push down the firing pin safety to get it started, and it'll lock itself in that position. You can't get the back on without pushing that down. So once again, we're going to start the back plate just a little bit and take a slightly fatter punch and just push in on that plastic enough to get the back plate started. Once it snaps in, it's going to take care of the rest automatically. And our extractor goes back in same way it came out. Spring spring has a little cup that it sits in, so you don't have to line it up and worry about it falling over. It's going to hold itself up in the cup. Again, because it's got the big, overbite, slide that in from the side. Get your pin lined up. And get that started. There's the hammer. And once that's started, we'll just taba. And that should be flush with the underside when you're done. For a loaded chamber indicator, they just kind of cheated and drilled this little conical hole, and that just basically lets you see the back of a round if there's one in there, but you kind of have to point the gun straight up to see it. So it's not the most efficient one in the world. A lot of times they'll have the extractor cam out further with a little red bar there. Again, loaded chamber indicators are a poor way to know if you have a round in your gun. It's better to know what the hell you're doing than to rely on that, or just assume you have one till you know you don't, or vice versa. To take the rest of this apart, we are going to have to knock out these two roll pins, and then everything else will come out accordingly. Please always use roll pin punches, in case you don't know the difference between regular punches and roll pin punches. Firearms, this is critical because they use roll pins for so many things. A normal punch has a flat surface, and a roll pin punch has a dimple, and that dimple will fit into the center of the roll pin and keep it centered, and then you're hammering on it, you're hammering evenly on the outside and only on the roll pin. If you just hammer on a roll pin, it's going to deform, and you're never going to get it back in after you do that a couple times. So a good set of roll pin punches is not something you will ever regret owning. These pins are two different sizes, so remember which is which, or when you stick it back together, you'll have one pin sticking way out on the back end for no particular reason. You'll find. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I just lied to you. Sorry. This one, they're the same. So you don't have to worry about that. I'm not sure which one I was thinking of, but there are guns that have roll pins where the one in the back is actually going through a smaller piece of the frame. I lied on this one. They're identical. The only difference between them is one has been sticking out just a little bit of the front because the takedown lever actually is designed to bottom out against that roll pin. That's why it has that little cut in it. And so while it'll be flush on this side, it'll actually protrude about as far out as the side of the polymer does there, so that this pin isn't actually bottoming out on the polymer but on the metal of the pin itself. Speaking of this pin, we can take this out now. If you just rotate it as it comes out, it'll come out because there is a little spring in there that's providing tension, and that spring rides in this channel, and if you rotate it far enough, then it'll push that down and you can start backing it out. Likewise, for putting it back in the gun, there's this half cut that you'll do to line up on the bottom with that spring, start it rotating, and that pushes the spring down, and that pops in and out like that. What's next? Trigger pin. Now, I will caution you, taking this trigger pin out is a little obnoxious because you got to get it back through this spring, and you're going to have to do that while it's under a little bit of tension. So if you're not deliberately changing out some of the parts here, if you're just cleaning or whatever, and you don't have to replace, you know, the slide lock or any of that stuff, don't take that out. But if you're putting in the new trigger kit or something like that, then obviously that's going to go in there. While we at the frame here on the side view, this is similar type of trigger safety to the Glock one, and that rather than a leg sticking out the middle of the trigger, they actually split the trigger in the middle with a rotating point here, and this leg, for the first part of its rotation, the top of the trigger isn't moving at all, and this is actually the same piece of plastic. This is going to bump into the frame. So if you just move the top of back, you're gonna bottom out on the frame right there. So the trigger safety makes you have to be pulling on the bottom half of the trigger to clear the frame before it can move the top half of the trigger backwards. Once again, how do we get around Glock's patents? So trigger pin has a wide end and a narrow end, and that way, you know, it only goes in one way. It's going to come out the left of the gun. As you push it out, that spring of the trigger bar is going to pop off and lose its tension. And now the locking block can come out. Do be careful of this itty bitty spring on the locking block. It just sits in here, and that's it. Ain't no tension holding it in, no nothing. It just literally sits in this itty bitty groove and does its thing. So don't lose that. Locking block, of course, is what our slide is grabbing onto to tilt the barrel down during the recoil and then back up when it closes. It's what intercepts the force of the barrel and stops its rearward motion. It's got to be made of metal to transfer the force into the polymer slide over a much wider area. So, and in this particular one, they also made the front rails part of the locking block. So all your metal is in one, big piece, as opposed to having to sink the metal into the actual polymer frame. And they did the same thing with the Sear block in the back. So this frame is all polymer. It didn't need to have metal inserts, which I assume saved them some money in a smart way, not like in a negative way. Once the locking block is out, your slide lock will just come right out. It is operated only by the left side of the magazine. When the follower comes up, this lifts it up, but it's one piece of metal all the way around, so you can operate it, with your hand from either side. I have seen these break, and I suspect it's because of that. When you're moving it from the right side, you're kind of going a long way around to relieve pressure that's actually back here. The slide's locked on this part of it, and you're grabbing this thing way over here. It's only so stiff this can be. It is welded together in there, but like I said, I have seen these break off at that weld before. Well, let me couch that. I've seen one. I'm not going to say it's a design flaw when I've seen one. I've seen one of everything break. All right, so at this point, our trigger bar and our trigger are going to be able to come out, and the trigger just lifts up through the frame, and the trigger bar itself, it goes back. If you can see, there is a small slot right there. That's actually where this long pointy end goes. So when you're putting this back in, you want to start that tucked under there and make sure it goes in there. If you've got that off to the left, it's not going to go in. If you got it too far off to the right or up high, you're going to get under the Sear. It goes into the big open space, essentially, in the back there. Function-wise, trigger return spring doing what it would obviously do in causing the trigger to return. It's also related to the so it's bringing the trigger back forward. If I recall, this one actually has a left-right disconnect, so the only other thing it's providing enough tension for, I don't even think it's related to the firing pin safety. The firing pin safety is there because it can't go down any further. Yeah, that's all that spring does, is trigger return. This is the firing pin safety lever part, so as you are pulling the trigger, and this trigger bar is going to be coming backwards as that happens, that's the piece that would be coming up into the frame and lifting up on that button. And so that's operating the firing pin safety. The other two important bits that we're going to get into when we start looking at the details of the Sear are the leg back here, which is actually part of one piece of it, and then this curved angle here. So when they machine this is one big ledge which gets folded over into this curve. This curve is fairly critical to everything about how this trigger pull feels, but we won't really understand that till we get into the Sear block back here. So that's just held in by the roll pin we already took out. Now that the trigger bar's out of the way, you'll be able to just wiggle this out and guide it out of the gun, and try not to lose anything as it comes out. Sometimes these are in tighter than others. Now the only other thing that's in here is the magazine. It is a reversible magazine, there's just a big pin spring in there. If you pop that off of the magazine release, it'll slide out. You slide it in the other way around, pop the spring back in, and now you've gone from left side to right side release. There's no real point in doing that. It's not rocket science. So, Sear system. Well, notably, our ejector is just kind of lying in there, so that'll come off. Don't lose sleep over it. They do make a version of this, I think, with safeties, and that makes this part more complicated, but this one that doesn't have one. I'm not going to describe that. Our little yellow takedown mechanism, now you can see exactly what it's doing. It's just a big rocker. It's got a spring that just holds it against that side. It never actually moves left or right against that spring. They just made it so that it would, hold in place with spring tension instead of just, making less clearance. That way, if this gets gummed up or dirty, because this is an area that will get dirty, then the spring kind of will still work. And all it's doing is it's lifting up the Sear so that it can't possibly do anything. So pretty straightforward mechanism, and then the magazine or your finger will come back and put it in there, and now something else has to lift up on it. And what that something else is the trigger bar. So the back of this is always going to bottom out because basically that firing pin safety is pushing down on it. The ramp is going to slide up under this bulge in the Sear. And so as this is sliding back, it's going to move the Sear up. So that ramp lifts it up. That's your whole Sear system. So that Sear is holding that striker back. You start to pull the trigger back and it lifts it up. And there's two different things that can bottom out here and control over travel. One is that you can only lift the Sear so far up before you've bottomed the Sear out, and the back of it can't go down any further. And that's generally, that's one of the things that you're hitting. The other is that the leading edge of this ramp can bump into the body of this Sear housing here, or if this tail is really long, then it would bottom out all the way in the back. Now, in my particular one, what's actually bottoming out is the front lip, the front edge of the ramp. So when I pull my trigger, that's my stop. So when they want to make one of these where you can control over travel, there's a couple different ways to do it. One is you can make a longer leg on this piece that bottoms out too early, and then you file that down and attempt to put it back together, try it again, file it a little more, and stop filing the minute it actually can release safely. You could also heat this up and bend this around, but once you heat this up, you're kind of avoiding all manner of warranty, because this is hardened to the exact right hardness it needs to be to never actually break under normal use, because its whole job is fairly critical. If it does not lift the Sear up, the gun no go bang. So bending this, not a smart idea. You will weaken the already relatively fragile in terms of thickness piece of metal. It's designed to be left in this shape forever, so bending it is only going to make it weaker. But you could theoretically lift the end up without changing. You have to look at where it first engages the Sear and make sure that doesn't change. So basically, you've got a little bit less than an eighth of an inch up this ramp that you could mess with. It's not worth it, is what it comes down to. There are other ways to control over travel with the front of the trigger. So stick to those; you'll live longer. And my spring fell off. No. Not only did my spring fall off, but now I've put it on backwards. Well, I'll pretend I did that on purpose, and we'll put it back together later. So what's holding this together now is there's just two mechanisms left. There's the Sear and its spring, and may or may not have a detent depending on which model. And we can knock that out with this pin. These pins aren't under a terrible large amount of strain because, you know, this rotates around them. They're going through a substantial piece of steel, and they're captivated by the frame itself. So you'll be able to knock that out. Keep a thumb on the Sear itself so it doesn't spring away. It doesn't have that much spring tension. But in my case, yes, I've got the one with the itty bitty spring and detent. This is an important thing. They changed this around after a couple years and made this a larger spring and a larger detent on some models. When you order that kit for Apex, you got to make sure that it's got the right size spring for yours, because this is the Sear spring, and they determined that this one is a little small and fragile, so they moved up to a larger one in subsequent models. Now, the Apex Sear, I'm a little baffled as to Smith's opinion on why they don't do this themselves. Essentially, it's an extended Sear. It's the exact same shape piece of metal, except it's longer, so that this curved bit that the trigger bar actually interacts with, it comes out further. It basically lets you engage the Sear sooner, and by pushing that angle out, it also alters the net amount of distance it has to travel up the ramp to fire. So the closer in this is to the actual pivot point, the stiffer that force will be. Again, what it's really going to give us is an advantage in how the reset works, and I'll get to that in just a second when I put it all back together and you see how that functions. That's one of the big things that people don't like about this gun, is the native reset. So the other thing is this, which we can take it out because we feel like it, but as a general rule, there's no real reason to, unless you find that it's so grubby you can't stand it. And again, it's just a big old spring pushing this piece into place. So the piece does have a channel it rides in, and it can't really go too far outside of it, and then the spring just holds it in place, and that's it. Now we have an empty Sear housing. So we will cram it all back together. I'm not sure what the smartest way to put this spring back in is. I suspect it's actually smarter to put the spring in first and then slide the plate in afterwards, simply because the spring is so hefty. And I'm butterfingers today. Successful in that part. Now if I can use my fingernail and fail epically. Put a pin in there to keep me from doing the same completely stupid thing a second time, which was I had it lined up, but when I knocked it out to the side. What is a smart way to do this? Let's think this through. If I had this up at the top, I might be able to catch that last coil with a fingernail. Yay! Alright, so that worked. Like I said, if you don't have to take that out, there's no compelling reason to, but you can get it back in. Just requires a little wiggling. Ta-da! Good as new. Now again, our nearly microscopic spring and detent has to go into the hole. It does at least have a recessed hole where that goes, so that if you can get it, even vaguely close to the right alignment, it'll sink in there all the way down. The whole spring is below the level of the detent. And then our Sear is just going to drop right in on top of it. And Sear pin slides right through. And yay, it works. So to show the disconnect, we're going to start to reassemble. Our extractor just lays back in there. And get the frame again. This groove here should match this bulge will match the groove in the frame. Likewise on the other side, so that's how you line it up. If you're paying attention to see how that's going into that little groove there, that'll help you line it up, and it slides in and at a little bit of an angle, and we'll go flush in there. And what I'm going to do for this next bit is I'm just going to put the trigger in without the trigger spring. I think I can demonstrate this without the trigger spring, and that way it'll be faster to demonstrate. But if I'm wrong, then we'll do the slightly slower demonstration. Alright, so that gives us the ability to simulate our trigger pull and lifting up our Sear. Now the disconnect, if you'll notice that there's a little bit of left-right wiggle room. There's a little space on the side here, especially towards the back of the trigger bar. The disconnect stroke actually pushes this trigger off to the left. And if you'll note, what happened there is that little ramp on the rounded edge down here slid just far enough over so that the Sear could snap down. And that means as we bring our trigger bar back forward, yeah, it does take the trigger spring to do this. How embarrassing. If the trigger spring were there, what you'll notice is that the trigger spring, while pulling technically straight back, because of the angle that this is at, it's also pulling it towards the inside of the gun. You know, if I were pushing up on this, it would push towards the outside. Since the spring is pulling down here and the attachment point is here, it means I'm pulling it towards the inside. So the disconnect pushes it to the outside and then lets go, and then the trigger spring is the reset force to pull it back under the spring when it clears it. Let's see if I can get that spring in there. And I tell you what we'll do. I'll tell you what. Is we're going to do that during full assembly, because I don't want to put this in twice, because it just sucks. So this trigger, there's on the new ones, there's a narrower side and a large side. The narrower side is at the bottom. On mine, I think it was old enough that this was more or less universal. I don't think it's a life-altering event if you get it backwards. The point is, one of them will have a completely enclosed spring loop, and obviously that's not the one that you're going to hook over the end, because you can't hook it over anything because the spring goes all the way around and there's no way to hook. So basically, the side that you can hook is the side you want to hook, and from which is the top and which is the bottom, it's going to ride in this groove here. And when it's riding in there, you want it to be sitting with the hook part up top and not at the bottom, and that way it doesn't work its way off. And now the fun part is that when we put all this together, we're going to have a point where we're going to have to get that spring caught as we're trying to put that pin in, and our spring is going to be under a bit of tension when we do that. So for now, we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to keep a finger on it to keep it in roughly the right position. We're going to start the trigger in at the front and then make sure that we guide it in to the actual opening in the back there, so we're roughly lined up and not way over to the side. Our magazine, our slide lock goes over it, and then our locking block with our tiny spring being held in the correct position is going to slide in. And again, these runners on either side, and there goes my tiny, tiny little spring. All right, tiny little spring in place. The runners go into these grooves, and the locking block will go in at an angle. Once our spring is past, you know, that part of the slide, we're okay. And we can, whoops, notice how I flipped my trigger spring around. Oh, it managed to get completely falling off. All right. Well done, genius. So, while failing to pay attention, I have managed to completely dislodge my spring. So let's put that back together one more time and try not to do that upside down again. Trigger in, magazine, excuse me, I keep calling this a magazine release instead of the slide lock. Slide lock goes in and goes around the trigger essentially. Then the locking block slides in along its grooves. And now we've got everybody in place, and our big challenge is really hooking that little spring. So I'm going to take one of my longer little roll punches, and I'm going to guide it through. And I'm going to be able to get through the locking block housing, the slide lock, and the trigger bar all pretty easily. And what I really want to do is hook that spring just so I can tug on it. And that's what I'm going to do when I come in with a real pin from the far side. Now remember, there's a wide end to this pin. It goes on the left. And so as we get this pin started in, again, it's going to start in and make it through the various pieces, and may have to wiggle it a little along the way to get it through each one. Sometimes it just helps to move them around with a punch, or possibly even to look and see which one we're actually having trouble with. There we go. With significant amount of light, we can actually see that we got the trigger, the trigger pin all the way through left side of the frame, locking block, slide lock, trigger itself, but we missed the spring by a country mile. So I'm going to back that off, come in from the other side with a smaller punch where I can hook that little spring and hopefully convince it to get around the trigger bar, which I did, and now the trigger bar can go all the way through, and you can see that the coils of that spring are already just a little bit spread out because it's always under some tension there. Now remember that we don't have our pins in, so if your frame is loose enough that either of these are moving, then before you start playing around with any of the rest of this, you'll want to go ahead and put those pins back. But what I was going to show you was the disconnect stroke now that we're all hooked up. So the trigger, again, this curved part of the trigger bar is going to engage under the bulge in the sear to lift the sear up. The disconnect is going to be caused by a lump in the slide that I'll show you in a second. It's going to push this out to the side, so it just clears the lump, and that lets the sear snap down. This spring is putting tension that wants to bring that back into the inside. So as we come forward, when this clears the lump, doop, that's our reset. The minute we pop back under there, we'll be pulling the trigger again. So that, reset, that, reset. So in a perfect world, this would only click once and then work. But what you're going to see when I put it together is there's a false reset. And it drives people crazy. And so one of the things that the longer sear does that Apex sells is it gets rid of that false reset that we'll get into shortly. So I'm going to knock my roll pins back into place. I think I established earlier in my embarrassment that they are in fact same darn size. Now sometimes you'll see me start roll pins with a hammer, but I don't finish them because I'm already deforming them, so it's never really justified. So Now you are going through a significant amount of metal in that Sear housing. Oops, I overpunched. We'll tap that back from the other side. And it should be nicely just a tad recessed on both sides so it doesn't stick out and grab your hand. As long as you can't feel the roll pin, you're good to go. Same thing on the front. I'm going to get it started with a whack, but then push it through with the actual punch so we don't mess up that roll pin. And on this one, we actually want to make sure that we come out further on this side. We want to come out so the left side is actually flush with the wider side of the frame, a wider part of the frame there, so that we're closer to that. Maybe even one love tap more. That's beautiful. So again, when we go to put the takedown lever back in, this cutout goes on the bottom where that spring is, so it can overlap the spring, so that when you rotate it, you push the spring out of the way. Once you line it up with the other side, now you're good to go. Ta-da! The spring force that is on this is coming not from that little spring, but from the recoil rod actually, which pushes on it nice and hard. So when you have it in this position, that's why it can snap up. Is it doesn't really have a flat surface it's pushing against. So the minute this is off even a little bit, it's going to snap back into the locked position there. Let's see. Let's look at the slide and see how that disconnect works. And what you're going to see is it's going to be easy to find because it's going to be in close proximity to the firing pin safety mechanism. So this thing that protrudes upwards that we already established is going to push that up. It's the same piece of metal that we want pushed out to the side, and this is that shape in the frame. So as this is as it's firing, you're going to push this down, but then as the slide recoils, this is going to come up, and this big bulge pushes that towards the outside of the frame, causing the disconnect right there. Pop! And then it comes back in and leaves it resting at that point if it's on the side of the Sear. So it's that intruding piece of the frame that's doing that for us. So to put it back together, same as taking it apart, put all the guts back in, like important parts like the barrel. Doesn't work nearly as well without a barrel. The hex head does go towards the front. It is the smaller end. And guide it onto the rails. Sometimes if you're not careful, you won't clear the ejector. Just pay attention to that so you don't mangle the various bits. There is clearance for them all. Just line it up as you go. When you pull it all the way back, snap that up, and you're back together. Now the other thing is that little yellow bar that we used to take down, we're going to lift that back up so that our trigger and Sear are able to engage again. So now when we pull the trigger, first thing, we're disengaging the trigger safety, then we're lifting up that firing pin safety, which we can't actually see, but then we're getting under the Sear, lifting it up and up and up and up and up until it gets out of the way of the striker. Now our reset, you might not be able to hear this, but as you're resetting it, you feel a couple different things. You hear a click, and in that case, that was the actual reset. A lot of times you can feel a distinct change when it's coming off of the firing pin safety, or actually I think what that is. That's when I'm moving around. Is that moving around or down? If I had enough light, I could answer that question. Let's see. There's a click, and it's either coming off of the firing pin safety or bumping into that disconnect ledge in the slide. And since I don't see it going up or down, let me see if I can, let's do this. So I come back, I see it get pushed down just a little bit, and then I'm bottomed out, lifting up. So that's the false reset. And you feel and you hear it, but the real reset isn't till further out there. And so I'm pretty sure that what you're hearing and feeling there is basically you're pushing the firing pin safety up and down, and that feels like a reset. You come off that firing pin safety and you feel it in the trigger, and you can even hear it as the safety bottoms back out. It does make a click, and it sounds like you've reset it. So when you come further off, then you get the real click, which is your reset. And a lot of people, that drives them nuts because they're going either by sound or feel when they're out on the range, and that first false reset drives them crazy. So by moving the Sear up a little bit and by lightening the spring on the firing pin, you effectively get rid of that false reset because you don't feel yourself come off the firing pin nearly as much, and so it doesn't make that audible click when it bottoms out. And that happens also at a much it basically brings the reset closer in as well, so that you're essentially resetting as soon as you're coming off. And so both of those events happen at the same point in the pull. So it gives you a much shorter reset at the same time as the false reset would otherwise be happening. So if you put the two events at the same point in time, you haven't so much eliminated the false reset as you've made the false reset also the real reset, and there's no longer a difference between the two, and it makes people a lot happier with the firearm. And who could blame them? So that is the Smith&Wesson M&P. Hope you liked it. Have fun out there.